I'm Tommy Salmons. This is year 0.
This thing's probably so long, no one wants to hear it anymore.
Hey, we need to mention Amazon Smile, Benevity, Cyber Grants, Just Giving, and GuideStar. Tell us a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, so, okay, first of all, Amazon Smile is where the Libertarian Institute is registered. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're registered with Amazon Smile, and that means so that whenever you go through smile.amazon.com and choose the Libertarian Institute as your favorite nonprofit organization there, then we get a little bit of a cut from their end of the sale from whatever you buy there, as long as you're on smile.amazon.com and signed up for the Institute. Mm-hmm. And so that's a great way to help support. And then those other things you listed there are Benevity and Just Giving. And let me see, I have the list here.
GuideStar and Cyber Grants is what you sent me.
Yeah, there you go. So all these are they're organizations that essentially are clearinghouses for corporations who provide matching funds to their employees' donations to nonprofit institutions. So in other words, you take a company like Benevity, what they do is they go to Apple or Verizon or General Motors or whoever, and they say, hey, instead of having an expensive department where you find what charities are acceptable to you, you just come to us and we will only list guys that we have vetted that you can feel comfortable doing matching funds for. And then your employees, when they want to donate to any of these things, you give matching funds and you'll know that it's all right to do so. And so then they do all the vetting themselves. And so that's essentially what all of these things are, is if you have a corporate job, and your company has a matching funds type of a function, then what you do is you I guess have them check with whichever company they use, Just Giving or Benevity or the others, and see if we're registered with them. And then, like you were just saying, we are. So that means then you can double all your donations to the Libertarian Institute and make your boss donate to us too. So that's pretty good. And it is our big fund drive, from now until the end of the year. We're trying to raise enough money to, really have a great start for the first year of the next decade here and really get the Libertarian Institute off on the right foot and make a stronger institute, better writers, new website, events, new books. Sheldon's working on a book. Thomas Edlum is working on a new Will Grigg book. I'm working on a book. All these will be coming out in the next year. And hopefully we'll be doing events and doing everything we can to grow this institute for you. And so it's our big fund drive. It's right at the top of the page today at libertarianinstitute.org and always at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And we have books and audio books and all kinds of great gifts and premiums and kickbacks for people who donate as well. So that's all at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thanks for letting me say that.
Yeah. I had the pleasure of speaking with Mike Maharrey this morning. He's a writer for the 10th Amendment Center and the host of the Godarchy podcast. He came onto the program to discuss the Defend the Guard Act, which is entering the state legislatures in the upcoming session, I believe starting in January for most states. And we discuss the Defend the Guard Act, how this may affect the federal government's power with foreign policy. There are moments, as you're hearing right now, that I might sound a little distant. For those of y'all who do not know, Pinky, the dog that makes appearances in the podcast every now and then, has passed away, and I had to bury him yesterday. So, it's been a pretty difficult, not even 24 hours yet. So just bear with me for this episode, and we'll get back into our normal tirades as soon as I feel capable. All right. I hope y'all enjoy this episode of with Mike Maharrey. All right. Let's see. This should be it. All right. So, I am here with Mr. Mike Maharrey, my favorite resource on nullification and all things constitutional. How are you doing this morning, Mike?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing awesome. I really appreciate you squeezing me in this morning as we get our week started here.
Oh man, I'm glad to do it. This is an important topic, and excited to get the word out on what's going on, man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really wanted to find a way to get you on the podcast as soon as possible, so that we could possibly get some recognition and get some people talking about it. Maybe get the word spread out and people know what's going on. Because I think at the moment, I don't think a lot of people really know what the Defend the Guard Act is. So can you define that for us? Let us know what's going on with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think just to kind of set things up, people who have been following along with the news probably have heard about the papers that were released by the Washington Post. I guess it was last week. Basically showing that for the last nearly 2 decades, the government's been lying to us about the war in Afghanistan, trying to make us think things are going better than anticipated, and basically just obfuscating and lying, which is what the government does when it comes to war. The government lies to get us into wars. It lies about what's going on during the wars, and it lies for the reasons that the wars are being fought. And one of the reasons that's the primary reason that the founders and the framers of the Constitution, in their wisdom, divided up war powers and, intended for Congress to make a declaration of war before the president was able to send troops willy-nilly into combat. And that's been ignored basically since World War II. We haven't had a legitimate declaration of war, and we've gotten to the point now that basically the president just decides he wants to send troops off, and next thing you know, we're in the next war. And the Defend the Guard Act is a way at the state level to at least try to chip away at the abuse of war powers that we've seen in the executive branch, and force Congress to do its job and actually at least debate these wars and make an official declaration. So what the Defend the Guard Act does, very simply, is it requires an actual congressional declaration of war as required by the Constitution before a state will release its National Guard troops for combat operations in a foreign country. And, it's interesting because over the last 2 or 3 decades, the military has depended really heavily on National Guard units to fill in and help the mission of the regular Army. So in essence, without National Guard assistance, the government's going to have a difficult time waging these wars. So if a number of states would actually pass this bill and put that kind of restriction on their National Guard units, it would at least force a debate in Congress. We may still have the wars when it's all said and done, but at least it would have to be done in a constitutional way. At least these senators and representatives would be put on record and would have to take responsibility instead of basically just passing it off to the president. So, this is a way that we can actually have an impact on the warfare state at the state level. And very important issue, I think. And there's a representative in West Virginia, his name's Pat McGeehan, who has kind of spearheaded this effort. He's introduced this in the West Virginia legislature every year since 2016. And last year, he actually was able to use some parliamentary maneuvering and actually get it on the House floor. And when that happened, it created quite a bit of buzz. The goal this year is to get it introduced in at least 20 state legislatures. And if that happens, it's going to make national news. It's going to start the discussion. It's going to create a lot of momentum, even if it doesn't get passed, which of course we hope it ultimately would. But even if it doesn't, it creates a lot of discussion, and I think it'll resonate with the public because, quite frankly, I think the American public is tired of endless wars being waged for really no reason whatsoever. So it's a really important issue. It's a way that people can push back at the state and local level. Congress doesn't listen to us. They don't want to have the responsibility of having to debate and declare war. So it's going to put an awful lot of pressure on them. We already have it introduced. Of course, McGeehan's going to introduce it again in West Virginia. It's already been pre-filed in Oklahoma and South Carolina. We have commitments from Wyoming and several other states. And like I said, the goal is to get it introduced in at least 20 states. And I think that's a very distinct possibility for the 2020 legislative session.
Okay, and when is that session? When does that session start? When do we need to be looking for this to be brought up in the public attention as far as in front of the state legislatures?
Yeah, so most state legislatures run part-time, so they're not year-round. Most of the state legislatures will convene in January of 2020 for that session. The legislative sessions, of course, it depends on the state, but generally they run between January and April or May. There are a few states that have year-round sessions. There are some that start a little bit later. I know Oklahoma doesn't start until February, but for the most part, you'll start seeing the legislatures open up in January, usually the first or second week. And, usually bills are introduced pretty quickly, so we'll probably see a big flurry in the first part of the year. And then, we can see others introduced as things move along. And, it's interesting because states are kind of copycats. So if it really does start to gain momentum, we may well see it really take off in February or so.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I know y'all had, I think it was you that published in the blog on 10th Amendment Center last week with the letter to send into the state legislatures. Can you tell us about that letter?
Yes, absolutely. I was just actually getting ready to mention that because this is a way that anybody who's listening can take 5 or 10 minutes and kind of help advance this movement. And, think about that for a second. When do you have an opportunity to really, in a significant way, push back against unconstitutional wars with just 5 or 10 minutes of effort? Pat McGeehan has written a letter to state legislators, and just does a fantastic job of summarizing the issue and asking these legislators to consider introducing this in their state legislatures. And he sent it out through a list that he has to a whole big slew of state legislators across the country. But there's nothing more powerful than a constituent interacting with their own representative and senator, And it's interesting because we tend to think of politics in terms of our experience dealing with Congress. And I don't know about you, I've called Congress before, and it pretty much felt like a complete waste of time. You call these guys up and you talk to some intern, and 3 weeks later you get a letter. Oh, we thank you for your phone call. I actually got a letter once that was thanking me for something it's not even what I had contacted Congress about. So it feels pretty useless. But State legislatures are different animals, and quite frankly, they're not used to getting a whole lot of public pressure. And it's been a number of years ago, but I actually talked to a state legislator up in Kentucky, and he told me that he has gone through entire sessions without ever hearing from a constituent on a particular bill. So when a state legislator actually gets interaction on a piece of legislation, they tend to be a little bit more, they feel that pressure a little bit more than Congress. You can actually have an impact at the state level that you're not going to have by calling Congress. So what we would love people to do is go to the blog. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/blog, I think, or blog.10thamendmentcenter.com is what it is. blog.10thamendmentcenter.com. And you can find this letter that Pat McGeehan has written. We've got it uploaded there. You can just download it. It's a PDF. Find your state representative's email and your state senator email. Attach that email or attach that PDF document, that letter, to your email. Write a few lines about why you think that this should be introduced and send it off to them. We would love to see state legislators getting 4, 5, 10, 20 emails from people in their districts asking them to introduce this bill. I think it'll increase the chances of getting it sponsored and co-sponsored across the country. And the more states that do this, the more power that it's going to have. So, like I said, it's a way that you can, in just 5 or 10 minutes with very little effort, a few clicks, Google your state reps and send that off to them and have an impact, man.
Yeah, and I'll when I post this, I'll post this up today, this afternoon. We'll have this podcast up, and I'll make sure I put a link to that because I downloaded it to my phone, and I'm gonna be writing to the state legislature this week and sending that to all the representatives I can get a hold of in Texas, which
yep, absolutely.
Don't know if it'll do any good in Texas, but we'll see. Maybe people don't understand like how important the National Guard is to the foreign policy of the United States. But I heard a statistic, and you may be able to correct me on this, but I heard a statistic that somewhere around like 40% of the troops that were in Iraq were National Guard troops.
Yeah, that's the statistic that I've heard as well. And it's interesting because as I've done, like I said, this bill was introduced in both South Carolina and Oklahoma. And when I was writing reports for the 10th Amendment Center website about the bill being introduced, I went and looked at their Guard units and to kind of see where their Guard units had been deployed. And in both of those states, Oklahoma and South Carolina, National Guard units from those states had been in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Kosovo, Kuwait. I think it was South Carolina that had a unit that was deployed into a country in Africa. So, yeah, these National Guard units are being deployed all over the world for combat operations. And, again, if you look at what the National Guard is supposed to be, it's the evolution of the state militia. Right. And if you look at the act that actually established the National Guard, it actually says in that law that it was established based on the militia clauses in the Constitution. So for legal purposes, the National Guard is the state militia. Now we can talk about whether or not that's what the militia was intended to be or not, but regardless, that's the legal justification for the National Guard. The National Guard is only supposed to be deployed for 3 purposes: to, repel an invasion, to deal with an insurrection, and, now that I started saying that off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember the third one. To enforce the laws of the Union.
Yeah.
So only 3 reasons that the National Guard is supposed to be deployed. Fighting a war in Iraq is not among those 3 reasons. So all of these Guard deployments are patently unconstitutional. So this is something that really is a way for the states to reestablish at least some semblance of constitutional control over their own state militias. And so, like you said, it's not only a legal issue. It's a very practical issue for the military, because they depend on these Guard and Reserve units to fill in, because they've shrunk the size of the regular Army and other branches of the military. So this can have a very strong impact, and it's certainly going to get the Pentagon's attention. In fact, from what I understand, there's already been some letters sent back and forth. And Pat McGeehan got pushed back way back in 2016. And here's what's going to happen. I'll just kind of warn people kind of what to expect. The Department of Defense is going to threaten these states with just removing their National Guard units, defunding them, moving those units to other states. And they may well try to do that. But I think people should be encouraged by the fact that it would be very difficult, especially if you had 10 or 15 states that actually passed this bill. There's no way that the Department of Defense is going to easily be able to disband those units, transfer them to other states. The logistics and the expense of doing that is going to be tremendous. It's going to put a whole lot of pressure on the Pentagon, no matter what they try to do. And anytime something like this goes down, you're going to get threats from the federal government. We're going to cut funding. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. They say a lot of things. Doing those things is a whole lot more difficult than they want you to believe. A few years ago, more than a few years ago now, it's probably been 5, 6, 7 years ago, when they first put the naked body scanners in the airport, Texas was like a gnat's hair away from passing a bill that would have criminalized the groping by TSA agents, who would have basically made it a sexual assault.
Yeah.
This bill passed the Texas House, and it was going to pass the Senate, from what I understand. And then all of a sudden, here comes the federal government, and they were sending out letters and saying, we're going to shut down all of the airports in Texas. And unfortunately, the politicians in Austin caved in on it. But I don't think the federal government ever would have really closed every airport in the state of Texas. I mean, think about what that would have meant. It would have basically shut down the entire commercial airline system in the United States. I mean, you have major hubs in Dallas and in Houston. There's no way the federal government was going to do that and then have to explain to the American public, oh yeah, we're shutting down the air system because we want our agents to be able to grab your crotch. That's not an argument that the federal government's going to want to make. And so I really wish that the senators had the guts to just say, you know what, go pound sand, we're doing this, and if you want to shut them down, go for it.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the federal government would have ever done it. It was a bunch of hot air. Yeah. And I think that's true when the Pentagon comes along and says, well, we're going to deactivate all of the Guard units in any state that passes this bill. They're not going to do it because, again, they're going to have to look at the public and say, you know what, we're doing this because we don't want to have to declare war like the Constitution requires. Well, okay, let's have that discussion then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if they have to vote to declare war, as the Constitution requires, it's going to bring more attention to how many different countries that the United States is engaged in. Number one,
right?
I mean, people. I know that people don't pay as much attention to Congress as maybe they should, but some of that is the media's fault in not covering it. So I guess the media could do like they do with the NDAA and just kind of ignore the issue altogether when the vote does come up, and then nobody will really know. But at least you have an opportunity to hold these people accountable as they're voting. And you were talking about the 3 reasons that the National Guard is justifiably put into action, and it made me remember when Katrina came through, and they couldn't get the National Guard troops into New Orleans to do to actually help with the evacuation and assistance, because they were on their way back from Iraq or Afghanistan. They had been deployed.
Yep. And
then when Katrina hit, there was no National Guard there to actually take action.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's the absurdity of it. The National Guard, the militia, is supposed to be first and foremost for the defense of the state. and then secondarily for the defense of the entire country. It was never intended to be an offensive military force, and that's what it's turned into. And so when you send troops off to do all of these things that aren't really within their scope, then they can't actually do the job that they're supposed to be doing. And we saw that, you're absolutely right, very vividly with Katrina, when they had to bring in National Guard units from other states because the Louisiana National Guard was off, fighting. I think it was in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken.
It may have been. Yeah.
And so yeah, it's kind of absurd. And again, the entire warfare state is what I call it. It has grown so completely out of control since 9/11. We've been engaged in war perpetually and continually for almost 2 decades. We have young people now that weren't even alive when Afghanistan started being sent to Afghanistan to fight in this war that we now know that the government's been lying to us about for the last 18 years. And there has to be some kind of check on this power. And, like you said, if Congress has to at least debate this and at least formally declare war, that's going to make news. They're not going to be able to hide all of these military operations under these vague, authorizations to use military force. We have troops in Syria based on the authorization to use military force to go after the terrorists of 9/11. I mean, how absurd is that? And, that's the reason that the founding generation wanted the legislature to have control over making war. The reason was it was supposed to be a deliberative body that actually represents all of the people. And so they're supposed to debate it out, decide when, if, and how America goes to war. The only thing the president's supposed to do is execute what Congress directs them to do. And it's interesting, you can go back to like the Barbary Pirates, back Thomas Jefferson was president, and the Congress had to actually pass a number of different statutes and resolutions and directions because Thomas Jefferson refused to take action until he was specifically directed by Congress to do it. So that's the model that we should have. That creates some accountability and control. Everybody knew the kings had a vested interest in going to war. It's good for a president to go to war. In fact, I was reading the other day, and I don't have the citation for this, and it could be, I'll say that with the caveat that maybe this isn't exactly true, but if it isn't, it certainly could be, that George W. Bush, Daddy Bush, told Junior that in order to get reelected, you need a war. You need to preside over a war. Yeah. There was that old movie, Wag the Dog. That was this whole, the whole plot was that president creates this war in order to get reelected. People love wars in terms of politics because it unites us together. As Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state. So we need to have that legislative and congressional control over the issue of war. That's exactly what the founding generation wanted. You can go back and read the debates of the Constitution. They talked about this constantly. Even George Washington, George Washington actually at one point said, I can't engage in any offensive operation without the approval of Congress. So this isn't even really debatable. The Congress has obfuscated and passed off its decision-making to the president, and the result is we have trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, and an environment that is basically constantly embroiled in war. And James Madison warned us that you can't have liberty in a state of perpetual war. So all of this impacts us directly down the line, because when you have perpetual war, you end up with the surveillance state, you end up with the militarization of police, you end up with less freedom at home, higher taxes, more debt, all of these things that crush our own personal liberty because these politicians want to run around all over the world and play empire building. So I think that this legislation is probably one of the most important things we'll see at the state level, certainly this year and even in years to come. Because if we can't do anything else, if we could simply lean in all of the wars, it would be a huge win for liberty.
Yeah, absolutely, and accountability, and you bring up the money spent and resources wasted on these wars, but what I just ran into a book the other day at a truck stop, and it's a book of short stories by I think the guy's name is Phil Clay. It's called Redeployment, and he was in the military, and the premises of every one of the stories, it's his what he's trying to do is he doesn't get into the policies or how bad the policies are that send these kids over to war, but he gets into the how being in this environment affects these guys emotionally.
Yeah.
And people, people talk about it. They talk about the 22 suicides a day. I've even heard some people talking about how many kids are committing suicide actually in the combat zones. But what these kids are being asked to do is not healthy, and this
No.
this is this is truly life saving. Being able to refuse to enter an offensive war and waste these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids' lives, to empower the state. And I think that's extremely important that we pay attention to the cries and the devastation that this is waging, not only in other countries but in the lives of our own children. My son is talking about joining the Marines next year, and I don't want him to, but I don't want to be that father that's like, I'm gonna do you. So
Right.
it's like I have to worry. And I told him, whenever he told me, I told him, I said, look, man, I'm not worried about you getting killed in combat. I said, I'm worried about what happens to you mentally whenever you're in combat. That's much more likely, to be a reality. I have a friend who was in the Navy and that suffers from PTSD just from the things that he experienced in Haiti and things of that nature. And, it's real. It's horrible. And we have to be aware that, war, for the sake of empire is not only devastating other countries, but it's also devastating our children and their future. And by engaging with the state legislatures and finding a way to almost like a go around to nullify the federal legislation and the foreign policy of the United States for the last 2 decades. That actually gives us some hope, and I really hope that people are going to engage in this with their state legislatures and bring attention to this issue.
Yeah, that's you make a really good point too about the just the psychological effects, and I would even go a step farther and say the spiritual aspect of what war does to the people of a country. And this was no mystery to the folks during the founding generation. In fact, James Madison, he wrote a passage about war, and he said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. And he goes through and he lists the things that war results in. He talks about war being the parent of debt and taxes. He says it's the known instrument for bringing the many under the domination of the few. And he talks about the fact that it expands the power of the government, particularly of the executive branch. But I think it was really interesting. At the end of this passage, he talks about how war, as he put it, it creates a degeneracy of manners and morals. It has an impact on the psyche of the country. And I don't want to get all collectivist, because I'm not a collectivist in any sense of it. But I do think there's a sense that the impact of war creates a mentality in society where it does create a degeneracy of manners and morals. It lowers our sense of the importance of human life. We start to not value life as much, particularly the enemy. But then that kind of seeps into the consciousness, and it creates this mentality that killing is a good thing. And then, like you say, it's a tremendous impact on the lives of the young men and women who are asked to go fight these wars. And it's one thing if you're being attacked. If the hordes are, landing on the beaches of, Florida or Texas or whatever, obviously you have to stand up and defend your place. But to just be going and fighting these wars, it's tremendous cost, and we've seen it. And I've talked to some of these guys who have been over there, and they've talked about what they've seen. And it's interesting how many libertarians you find in the ranks of former military folks, particularly the rank and file soldiers who were the boots on the grounds, because they've seen the futility of it. They've known all along that the government's been lying to us. They didn't need Pentagon Papers to tell us that.
Right.
So I think that's a really good point, and something that cannot be understated. The impact of war on our children, and like you said, I've got a son that's 20 years old. He hasn't shown any interest in being in the military, but it's not out of the question at some point that somebody might decide it's a good idea to start drafting these kids. And, it's a scary thing, and I wouldn't hesitate to tell my son to do whatever he could to get out of the country or whatever, because there's no reason to go be cannon fodder for some politician.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't know. Do you know the statistics of how many kids are National Guard versus regular military? Do you have the numbers?
I do not.
Okay. I was just curious. I was just curious if we. I'll see if I can't find that somewhere. But it's really difficult for me to look at this and not see the benefits. I'm trying. The only thing I can think of that might this wouldn't affect are these covert operation missions in which they're using special forces, but there are special forces within the National Guard. I don't know how much they're being used in countries like Somalia.
Yeah, well, I know for a fact that the West Virginia National Guard has a special forces unit in it that has been deployed numerous times. That was something that Pat McGeehan brought up, the legislator there in West Virginia. So, and certainly you're not going to, we're not going to stop the wars with this legislation. I don't have delusions of grandeur. What I do know it will put pressure on the national government. It will force Congress. If enough states pass this, it would force Congress to at least declare war. That's not to say that they won't, but at least they would have to do it. They'd have to have the discussion. They'd have to be on record, and these Congress critters would have to go back to their districts and face their voters and justify why they're sending their kids off to die in these wars. And so, that's a net plus. It's not the end-all, cure-all. We're fighting a behemoth government that does what it wants to do. But I think anything that we can do to have an impact is an important step to take. And, who knows what type of momentum and other things that can grow out of this movement. Ultimately what we need is enough people to stand up and say we're tired of the wars. And I think that is starting to bubble up in the population. I think that part of Trump's appeal during the campaign was that he at least paid lip service to the idea of, America first, and not being in every conflict across the globe. Now, unfortunately, actions haven't been quite what the rhetoric was, but the fact that he was able to go into a state like South Carolina and actually criticize the war in Iraq, I think that's a positive.
Right.
So, I think this is another opportunity to bring this issue into the forefront, to talk about this issue, and to give people permission to say, you know what, we're tired of this, and it doesn't mean that I'm not patriotic or whatever. I don't, quite frankly, personally care about being patriotic, but I know it's important to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But we can say, you can be a quote-unquote good American and not support every damn military intervention in, some sand pile in the Middle East. It's just absurd to me.
Right.
It makes me angry.
Well, and to give Trump a little credit, he hasn't started a new war, but we have to recognize that
That's true.
That when Congress voted to, end the support for the Saudi war in Yemen, as Scott puts it, America leading from behind against the Houthis,
right.
Trump vetoed that, which I just don't even see that as a legitimate power of the president to be able to veto an issue of war in that manner, but he did, and he got away with it. And he still pays lip service to the idea of going to war with Iran. He still pays lip service, and in every war game, I think it was the Department of Defense has been running war games against Iran, trying to figure out how they could defeat Iran, and there's just no feasible way in an actual land war to defeat Iran because of the terrain. That if you think Afghanistan has been just horrible, a war with Iran would be like 10 times worse than Afghanistan. And these people want to send your kids to Iran. They are looking for any excuse to do this. And if we can just chip away at some of these powers that they believe that they have, then it's worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
And I'm reading a book. I'm one of several books. I jump around from book to book because I have like this really crazy attention span. But one of the books I'm reading is Presidents of War. And it's really interesting. And it talks about how every president from Madison, not Madison. I'm blanking on his name now. The second president. Adams? Adams. How from Adams to today has used war to expand the executive power, and how that's come about. And if we can get one of the major things that I hear a lot of people talk about, not just libertarians but conservatives as well, and even some progressives you hear pay lip service to the idea of getting the executive branch back in check and to stop having basically dictator type of authority over matters like war. So that this movement is worth spreading to everybody out there.
Yeah. I've made this argument before. Conservatives talk about being limited government, and yet it seems to be that conservatives are the most apt to support whatever foreign intervention that's on the table. And I've said over and over again that war is not conservative, because it's exactly like you just said. It expands the power of government, particularly the power of the presidency and of the executive branch. And Robert Higgs, the economist, he wrote some fantastic book and came up with this concept called the Ratchet Effect. And he talks about how every time there's a war, every time there's an expansion of government power, it ratchets up. Mm-hmm. And then it might, after the war's over or after the crisis is over, Crisis in Leviathan is the name of the book. After the crisis is over, then, it might
ratchet down a little bit, but it never goes back to what it was before. So every crisis, you end up pushing the power of government and the intrusiveness of government in your life up a little bit, and then it never goes away. And perfect example, 9/11, the Patriot Act. I mean, they just renewed provisions of the Patriot Act. This is something that happened after 9/11 that allows the federal government to basically spy on you. It was buried in an appropriations bill, and they extended those powers even farther. Here we are 20 years out,
Yep.
So the ratchet effect is a very real thing. And like you said, if you really believe in limited government, if that is something that is fundamental and foundational to your political worldview, then you cannot support the endless wars, because endless wars inevitably leads to bigger government. And if you're a progressive and you're not really concerned about big government, you still have to think about the fact that all of this executive power is in the hands of Donald Trump right now, And if you don't like Donald Trump and you don't want him to have all of this power, then you need to think ahead a little bit and maybe realize that the power that you give any given president is going to go to the next president, and you don't necessarily know that that's going to be a dude that you want to have that kind of power. So I say that everybody has a vested interest in limiting war and ultimately limiting government, because somebody said this once. I thought it was funny, but I think there's a grain of truth in it. You should never give the federal government any kind of power, like you would never give that power to your ex-spouse, because you don't want them having that. So maybe we should think about how much power we give the government, and think ahead about, all these Trump supporters who love all of the government expansions that Trump is into. Keep in mind that the next president may not be somebody that you like, and they're going to have every bit of power that Trump did. So,
right. Well, and I think conservatives get concerned, and maybe both of us can kind of speak a little bit to this. I think conservatives are concerned that, because it's typically it's the more conservative, more Republican households that send their kids off into the military, into war.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that's not 100% accurate, but for the most part, that's who joins the military. They grow up in a patriotic, household. Their fathers and their grandfather military, and they're carrying on the legacy of their family and tradition. And I think they get concerned with, well, we're demonizing the troops, we're demonizing our children, and that's not what we're doing at all. We're discussing the policies and how devastating these policies are to those children, and part of protecting those children and making sure that those children, those kids' lives aren't wasted, is standing up to the expansion of empire and the federal government, and saying, look, you're not going to waste our future generations just so you become more powerful, and so you become richer and more powerful. You look at it since 9/11, and that 8 of the 10 richest counties in the United States are around Washington, D.C. This is no accident. All these wars,
right.
People, even the progressives, want to talk about inequality. This is a function of the wars and the Federal Reserve that has created this small pool of wealth around the nation's capital.
Absolutely. And military recruiting is built on complete bullshit. Let's just call it like you see it. It drives me crazy every time I see. I watch sports, and you get a lot of military recruiting ads during sporting events, because a lot of young people watch sports, and it just drives me crazy because they make it look like a video game.
Right.
It's going to be like going out and playing Call of Duty in real life, and it's going to be so cool, and it's a bunch of crap. They're going to go out there, and you're going to lose your hand and end up crazy. They don't ever show that part,
Yeah.
And then this whole notion with the National Guard, especially, just 1 weekend a month, and 2 weeks a year, and then you get to go help people in hurricanes. They don't tell these kids that they're going to send them off to die in some desert.
Right.
So, yeah, absolutely. This isn't a condemnation of the military even. It's a condemnation of the politicians and the policies that perpetuate empire building and endless war and use these kids as cannon fodder, again, for the whims of politicians, because somebody has the opportunity to get rich by destroying a country and then rebuilding it, or absconding with their resources. So this is for the troops. If you are a supporter of the military, then you should absolutely be for this. You should not support them being sent off to war in a way that is outside of the Constitution. And you should support any check and balance to make sure that if we are going to send these young people off to fight, that it's for a damn good reason and not just because some politician has a bug up his butt.
Right. Yeah. The day that Congress and lobbyists lead the charge into a battlefield is the day I support a war.
Absolutely. I'd be awesome if they could just get the politicians to put them in a ring and let them fight it out.
Right.
And then the winner can be the winner.
Yeah, because I mean, in reality, that's what this is. This is the argument.
Yeah.
This is a fight between governments. It has nothing to do with me. I don't have any beef with people in Afghanistan. They're way over there.
Right.
I didn't even know about Afghanistan before they started sending kids over there.
I imagine there's some perfectly nice people in Afghanistan.
You know what?
I
assume
nice people in Iran.
I assume that they would much rather be live and let live than be occupied by a dominant force like the United States military. I would just assume that to be accurate.
I'd say that's 100% accurate. I mean, think about that for a minute. I ask people to have this thought experiment sometimes. Imagine if some foreign soldier was standing at your street corner with the big rifle and shot one of the kids in the neighborhood because they construed him as I mean, how would you react to that? I mean, you would, most people would stand up and fight back.
Right.
And this notion that somehow we should blame people in Iran, or there's a funny it's a funny meme, but it's not inaccurate, that shows all of the military bases that are around Russia, and the caption is something to the effect of, "How dare Russia put its country so close to our military bases?"
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of truth in that. It's there's a lot of antagonism and kind of poking the bear, so to speak. And with Russia, that's a pun intended. But we create these problems and then blame people when they react in a way that's entirely appropriate for the problem that's being created. Yeah. And that's why I would like to see, I love the idea of Thomas Jefferson's foreign policy, peaceful trade and interaction with all, entangling alliances with none.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Yeah, and that's actually this book actually starts off talking about Jefferson, that Presidents of War. It starts talking about Jefferson and how he put the sanctions on England and how that's what led to the War of 1812. Yep. And in one of the things it says in the beginning chapter, in the opening chapter, it's talking about Jefferson's foreign policy and how even at that time that Congress was laughing at him, that they were mocking him for being such a quote unquote pacifist, which I don't think he was a pacifist at all. I think he just believed in self-defense and not offense. But yeah, it's been in the, I don't know how it became the dominant idea of men. Maybe this is just thousands of years of conquest and domination, soaked into our evolutionary memory, or however that works. But it's even from the beginning of the country, there were the war hawks, so to speak, that wanted to go to war. The only difference is they actually had fought in a war prior to sending your kids off to die.
Well, yeah.
So,
Which also kind of goes to show, even a lot of the politicians in the founding generation that talked a good game, like Jefferson, Madison, even were not immune from the allure of the power that military conquest would give them. Like you said, the foreign policy of Jefferson led to the War of 1812. That was a war that Madison, he was the one that got that one kicked off, and yet he wrote so eloquently about the terrors and dangers of war. So I guess the lesson there is that all politicians suck ultimately.
yeah. I mean, it's funny that it's embedded in the Constitution that you will not fund the military for more than 2 years. And then you turn around and you look back, and George Washington was funding the military, the entire time he was in office. He fought he fought off 21 different rebellions or something like that. So,
right, and you had the Indian War. I mean, there's I want to say it's 17 years. There's not very many years that the U.S. has been completely at peace.
Really, yeah.
I think it was 17. I think 17 is the number. It's low like that, like less than 2 dozen.
Yeah. Well, for a country that's 240 years old, what do you expect? Yeah. So,
yeah.
But let's get back to this Defend the Guard Act. We could go off on foreign policy and the history of our foreign policy for a long time here. So, what are any closing comments you have on the Defend the Guard Act?
Well, I think that, I just want to reiterate that the most important thing is to get public support of these bills when they're introduced. We've already talked about how folks can get involved in trying to get them introduced in their state by sending, emails, calling up their state legislators, sending Pat McGeehan's letter, and those type of things. It's going to be equally important once these bills are introduced to support them and to call your representatives and your senators and let them know that you support the bill, and make them feel the public pressure to encourage them to pass this legislation. I can't emphasize enough how important public pressure is, particularly in state legislatures. And again, to resist the mentality that we have kind of ingrained in us, having dealt with Washington, D.C. for so long, that, well, they're not going to listen to me. Not saying that there's not lobbyists and money and all of that stuff in state politics, because it's certainly there, but to much less a degree than in Washington, D.C., and the average person has much more influence and clout in the state legislature than they do in their Congress.
Right.
So once these bills are introduced, and like I said, they've already been pre-filed in Oklahoma and South Carolina, keep up with what's going on at the 10th Amendment Center at the blog, 10thamendmentcenter.com. And, when you see that it's been introduced in your state, make sure you take a few minutes, call your state legislator, your state senator, and let them know that you support this legislation, that you would like them to vote yes. Again, it's something that'll take you 10 or 15 minutes. It can make a huge impact. I have literally seen bills get passed out of a committee simply because 30 or 40 people took the time to call committee members and say, hey, we want this bill to be considered and passed. So that's the biggest thing. Get involved. People want to know how you get involved. Well, that's one way to do it. And you're much better off spending your time fighting at the state and local level than you are trying to worry about what Donald Trump is doing in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump doesn't give a crap about you. Your congressman isn't listening to you. We joke sometimes, but it's not even really a joke. Never call the 202 area code. Don't even bother with Washington, D.C. Make these efforts and spend your time at the state and local level where you can actually have a real impact. That's the thing that I would really emphasize. I said, when you see this introduced, take a few minutes, contact your representatives and let them know you support it. South Carolina, Oklahoma already pre-filed. Definitely will be introduced in West Virginia. I know for a fact it's going to be introduced in Wyoming, and I'm certain that there will be other states that will follow as well. So that's the big thing. Number one, encourage your state reps to introduce it, and then two, once it's introduced, support them and put the pressure on to get it passed.
Absolutely. And make sure you tap me on the shoulder as this moves forward, and we'll have you back on. We'll talk about it some more, and we'll as more information comes out, more states get involved, we'll be able to discuss this early and often, and
My goal too is as they get introduced, we're going to start sending out national press releases, and we're going to try to get this discussion going on at the national level as well, so that hopefully the mainstream media will pick up on it.
Yeah.
Folks might remember a few years ago when we were pushing to get the water turned off at the NSA facility at Bluffdale. While that ultimately didn't happen, it created some great discussion about the overreach of the NSA and made people aware that, hey, we can do something at the state and local level if we have the guts. So I'm really hoping to get this, turn this into a national discussion about war powers and about ending the unconstitutional wars, because I think that's an important, as much as anything, like I said, having that discussion is important. That was one of the wonderful things about the Ron Paul presidential runs, is he injected foreign policy into the national debate. Absolutely. So this is an opportunity to do that with a piece of state legislation as well.
Right, and this isn't an ideological thing. I mean, this is a humanitarian thing. This is any ideology can get behind this movement and just giving more power back to the people of the states, and kind of chipping away at the federal powers. So, what are you working on right now? What we got looking forward to?
Well, that's the main thing. I just got finished moving, so yeah. I'm trying to get settled. I haven't done anything in 2 weeks other than try to figure out where all my stuff is. What box is this in? So I'm just getting settled back. But, we'll have the holiday, and then, like I said, we'll hit the ground running the first week in January when these state legislatures start convening. And at that point, for me, it's going to be a lot of writing of bill reports and interacting with state legislators. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're putting together a FAQ, frequently asked questions, for legislators about the Defend the Guard bill that are going it's going to go through exactly the constitutional basis and address up front some of the opposition that we know will come out. So that's something we're working on. That's one of the big things we do at the 10th Amendment Center is kind of that behind the scenes work with state legislators to get bills passed. And of course, this isn't the only issue that we'll be working on. We're working on efforts to promote sound money, to decentralize education, decentralize health care, in the surveillance state, federal gun control, pushing back against that. That's obviously something that's becoming more and more a thing in the news. So that's the overall objective. If people aren't familiar with the 10th Amendment Center, head over to 10thamendmentcenter.com and check out what we're doing. Our whole objective is to use state and local power to undermine federal authority. And I tell people all the time, it's not because we think state governments are great, because they're not. They suck too. But we believe that a centralized authority is the biggest threat to liberty, and the federal government is the biggest centralized monopoly on power that exists in the world. So if we can do anything to decentralize, to take power away from Washington, D.C., devolve it to the states, devolve it to the local level, ultimately we'd love to see it devolved all the way down to the individual. But decentralization is a key strategy for liberty, and that's really what we're working toward at the 10th Amendment Center from a very practical to undermine federal authority and decentralize the system. So check out 10thamendmentcenter.com when you get a chance. We would love for you to support the work. We have a membership program. You can be a member for as little as like $2 a month. A lot of people, $2 a month, that adds up and helps us continue the work that we're doing. So we would definitely encourage people to check that out if it's something you're interested in.
Yeah, 10th Amendment Center is one of my go-tos every week. I look at the 10th Amendment Center at least 3 or 4 times every week, just scrolling through, seeing what's going on, because I know y'all keep up with a lot of activism and a lot of the government overreach, and it's very, very much appreciated. Anywhere else that people can find your writings?
Well, you can find some of my work at michaelmaharrey.com. I have my own podcast, although it's been kind of on hiatus with the move and whatnot.
Right.
But I do have a website. I have a couple of books that I've written that you can find at the website. One about nullification. It explains this whole idea of using state and local power. It's called Our Last Hope, Rediscovering the Lost Path to Liberty, and that's available over at my website. I also have a side project called Godarchy at godarchy.org, which is a kind of a Christian Christianarchy, I guess is the best way to put it, Christian voluntarism, a little bit more of a hardcore anti-government takeover there. But if people are interested in that type of thing, in the intersection of Christianity and the state, you can check that out at godarchy.org. And then I'm on Twitter at mmaharrey 10th. That's the number 10th. And then I also do the Shift Gold website. So if you're interested in economics and Federal Reserve and how the federal government is destroying your money, you can check out that stuff over there at shiftgold.com/news. All that stuff over there is pretty much what I've written. So
I might need to go over there.
that's about it.
All right. Well, if you could just hang on one second, I'm going to shut down this recording, and then I wanted to ask you a question, just real quick. All right. Now, hold on one second. Let me see here. All right. Well, that was my interview with Mike Maharrey this morning about the Defend the Guard Act. It's always fun to talk to Mike. He's, as I said early on in the conversation, he's a great resource on all things nullification. If you haven't checked out his book, Our Last Hope, I encourage you to do so. You can get it at his website, mikemaharrey.com, or you can go and get it from the Audible store as well. I don't know if he's selling the audio version on his website. Maybe check it out there. Make sure he gets any kickbacks that he's entitled to for the sale of that book. And it is a very good book, and it breaks down nullification in such a great way that you could give it to an 8th grader, and they would be able to digest the arguments for nullification and how it can be used state by state and by the people of the state. So I really encourage everybody to get a copy of that book. It's a very good book. It's a great introduction into nullification, and makes it very easy to digest for even the lamest of laymen. So I know there was a little bit of a audio problems, and there was a buzz in the interview. I apologize for that. I tried to clean it up as best as I could. We had a cloudy day here in southeast Texas, appropriately so, as we're all feeling a bit under the weather with the loss of our loved one. So I apologize. I did clean it up as much as I can. I hope that it wasn't too much of a hassle for everybody to listen to. Real quick, before I let you go to my brother's website, bossbrosdiamonds.com, for all of your dabbing essentials. You live a dabbing lifestyle, go to bossbrosdiamonds.com and get the gear that shows everybody that you are a dabber. Just dab it. bossbrosdiamonds.com. Make sure you go to antiwar.com and check out all the foreign policy news being posted every day. I hope to see you at the libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you're giving those donations so that the Libertarian Institute can grow. libertarianinstitute.org and the 10th Amendment Center. You can find this episode at the 10th Amendment Center, thanks to Mr. Mike Maharrey. And there is so much more there at the 10th Amendment Center to check out. You have Michael Bolden writing there. You have Mike Maharrey, and I believe there's a few others that don't know the names off the top of my head, but I would suggest go check out the 10th Amendment Center. They always have some really good stuff going on there. So that was today's episode of Year Zero. I almost said Stranger Encounters. Oh my God. What am I doing? No, Year Zero. Go check out my buddy's podcast, The Invictus Mind, released today. Interview with yours truly, and I will be re-releasing that at a future date as well. So, thanks for tuning in. I'm Tommy Salmons. Late.